Okay. A reading in 3 parts. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham?"
Here I am.
He replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants,
Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you.
Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?"
Yes, my son.
Abraham replied, "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered,
God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son.
and the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven.
"Abraham, Abraham."
Here I am.
He replied.
"Do not lay a hand on the boy.
He said,
Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son."
Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said,
On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided.
"The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said,
"I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the skies and the sands on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me."
Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba.
Testing. Hello, everyone. I feel like the worship team put in a lot of effort into making everything really Christmassy, and I'm really sorry, but this sermon is not going to have anything to do with Christmas, so I apologize for that. But what it does have to do with is our big year theme for this month, which is being faithful. So, the story we just heard, if you need a recap or if it was a bit confusing, is God told Abraham, "You need to sacrifice your son." Abraham says, "Okay, sure, you know what?" So he takes his son over to the mountain, and he's about to kill Isaac when suddenly an angel appears and tells him not to go through with it. Abraham sees a ram caught in the bushes and sacrifices it to God, and then God says, "Good job, you passed my test. I know that you were willing to you love me so much that you're willing to give me your son. We're all cool now." I feel like a common, sort of the traditional take that you get on this story in a lot of churches, and possibly you might have a different experience, but what I usually hear people take as the message of this story is it's all about how we should obey God. Obedience to God trumps any other considerations, even if it seems difficult or perhaps cruel. You should, instead of trusting your own judgment, you should always be orienting your life that you do whatever God tells you to do. Of course, it's within limits. I've never been to a church where anyone said, "We should bring back child sacrifice." But generally, there's this idea when people use this story where they're saying, if God told you to do something that you think is wrong or unfair, you need to do it. I think there are some problems with this kind of interpretation, because aside from taking us down some very weird rabbit holes ethically, I just don't think it's very helpful for forming our sense of right and wrong as Christians. Is this story supposed to be preparing us for occasions when God is going to ask us to do something cruel and hurtful? Is it supposed to make us feel as if God is a bit undependable and manipulative? So then there's this other take that you sometimes get at the sort of subversive or progressive response to the story, which will say that the real test was of Abraham's moral backbone and he failed it. This kind of interpretation says that Abraham should have argued with God. He shouldn't have just rolled over backwards and said, okay, whatever you say. God was testing Abraham's ability to pick right from wrong, and he failed. This is a great way of viewing the story because it makes it all nice and wholesome. It does throw Abraham under the bus to preserve God's dignity, but that's okay. The only problem is that I think there's not really much evidence for it in the text. If we read this story, I don't really get the impression that God is happy, that God is mad that Abraham was going to sacrifice his son. He literally says, because you have done this, you are going to be rewarded. But I also think there's a bit of an issue because it's trying to sanitize what is very deliberately a dark and disturbing story. And I think when we approach the Bible, we often approach it with a Sunday school kind of approach where we're thinking, this is a nice picture book story that I can tell to my kids, and there's a moral of the story. And in this case, the moral of the story is kill your son if God asks. But I think when we read the Bible, we need to avoid that temptation to, I think, oversimplify things and try and rush to sanitize stuff that is confronting or concerning. And I remember a couple months ago when we had the guest lecturer from Trinity, if you remember, who talked about the famous psalm that says, "Blessed are those who bash your babies against the wall." I think that's the kind of take we should be taking. We should be respecting the nuance of the text and not rushing to make it less threatening or less hurtful. So, we've kind of discussed two interpretations. Number one, the traditional one. This is a nice, easy right and wrong story about how we need to obey God no matter what and trust his will over our own flawed human reasoning. Then we have the second one, the subversive one, which says this is all about how blind faith is wrong and Abraham should have disobeyed God. I think the issue with both of these positions is that they're very fixated on the question, is it okay to kill your son if God asks? Which, incidentally, is the title of this sermon. But I think this is a bit of a red herring because this story is not supposed to be a nice Sunday school ethical parable with a neat takeaway. And it's not even really supposed to be some kind of complicated philosophical dilemma about whether God can command good things or not. What I want to suggest today is that really this is all about exploring in the most dramatic and extreme way possible the idea of having faith in God even if it seems like God himself has turned against you. It's very easy to be faithful, as we heard in that last song, when streams of abundance flow and the world's all as it should be. But what do we do when it feels like God has betrayed us, abandoned us, or even baited us into a trap? What does faith look like in some of the hardest times imaginable? And so this is still a very unsettling story, to be sure. I'm not trying to say we should all be very chill and okay with it. But not because it suggests God might ask us to do evil things, but because it suggests the even scarier idea that God might just up and abandon us someday. So before we get into that, let's rewind to the background lore on Abraham and Isaac, because it's really important to remember that Abraham is not just a random father, and Isaac is not just a random kid. So the whole story of Abraham starts with God making contact with Abraham and offering him a rather curious deal. He says, "Leave your homeland and your family and travel to a distant land, and I will make of you a great nation," which of course became the Jewish people. So when God makes this deal with him, Abraham and his wife Sarah do not have kids. They are like 80 or 120 or something ridiculous. They do not have children. Descendants were really, really important in the ancient world. And Abraham and his wife were very, very old. And back in the Old Testament, they didn't really have a concept of the afterlife or going to heaven when you die. A good legacy through having kids who would remember you and kind of pass on your bloodline was about as good as it got. So for Abraham and Sarah to be past their prime with no offspring isn't just another one of those regrets, but it's a fundamental failure in the eyes of the people of their day. They were going to die without any kind of legacy, anyone to remember them, any proof that they had lived. So God, when he offers Abraham a child, he's not just kind of offering Abraham, he's not just saying, oh, Abraham would really like to be a father, I'm going to offer him a kid. He's offering something really, really enticing. He's offering him the chance to not feel like his life was a failure or a dead end. And God doesn't just stop at one child. Abraham is going to have a whole nation of them. So Abraham and Sarah set off for the land of Canaan to take part in this mysterious covenant. Unfortunately, along the way, his wife Sarah gets a bit impatient and gets Abraham to sleep with her slave girl Hagar to try and speed things along. And so they have another son called Ishmael. But even then, God isn't really impressed. And while he blesses Ishmael and says, yeah, he's cool, he'll have his own little family and all that, God reminds Abraham that his promise was for his and Sarah's son. God's promises do not hinge on Abraham's creative problem-solving techniques, such as having a baby with your slave woman. They hinge only on God's promised miracle, specifically Isaac. So when we come back to this story of the sacrifice of Isaac, it's not just a random story about God asking someone to do something deeply immoral to prove they love him. The entire time, Isaac has been the key to every single one of God's promises. Isaac is not just a beloved son or an innocent victim, but he represents all of Abraham and Sarah's hopes. Without Isaac, this whole story is the sad, ridiculous tragedy of a desperate aging couple who got duped into throwing everything away for a fever dream. And it basically makes God into the divine equivalent of those Nigerian prince scams that you get on email. So when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac to him, it's like some sort of cruel prank. God has been telling him the whole time, this son is going to make you a great nation. This son is going to have so many kids you won't be able to count them. And then suddenly he goes, also, by the way, can you kill your son because I want to see if you really love me? So it would be easy for Abraham to think, maybe God's just stringing him along with false hopes. Maybe God has been playing some sort of elaborate prank. Maybe he just wanted to see the look on Abraham's face when it all got snatched away. Not only is Abraham faced with a time of extreme difficulty, but even God himself seems to be his enemy. The theologian Gerard von Rad described Abraham's experience as walking the road out into God-forsakenness. And John Calvin said, Abraham is being asked to sacrifice his own life, leaving nothing for himself but death and hell. And there might be times in our lives when we feel like God has abandoned us, or maybe even outright betrayed us. Maybe we got our hopes up that things would get better, and then they got worse. Maybe God opened a door, only to slam it in our face again. Sometimes it might seem like God gives us good things only so he can torment us more when he takes it away. And worst of all, when we think these things, we might feel guilty or sinful, like we're blaspheming God. But this actually isn't an uncommon sentiment in the Bible. Job is a whole book about a guy who has a serious bone to pick with God, while Psalm 89 flat out accuses God of breaking his own promises. Even on the cross, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So Abraham is not in a good position. It feels like God has basically thrown him down the river, been stringing him along for the whole time, and then now that he's had his fun, doesn't have any use for him. But Abraham does a quite astonishing thing when it seems like God has abandoned him, and when it seems like God is breaking his own promises and shattering the covenant into pieces. He goes along with it. This is really this is an act of remarkable faith, because God has taken away all the inspirational Bible verses like, I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope for a future. And we know God works all things for good for those who love him. And he's replaced them all with a very simple message instead, which is just, kill your son. And then Abraham seems to comply. And if we think about it, Abraham basically has two choices. He can either, A, believe that God is just messing with him at this point and give it all up and admit that he's basically been strung along, or he could trust that God is true to his promise to make him a great nation through Isaac, that Isaac can't die, and so something deeper is going on. There's really no other choice. He can't slice and dice, and arguably, this is as much of a test for God as it is for Abraham, because it's the decisive moment that tells Abraham whether God is a God who keeps his promises or not. And so Abraham chooses to trust God even when it seems like God himself might be his enemy. He trusts that even if he can't quite see a way forward, God is for him and not against him. He trusts that even in the midst of a despair so great, it seems that like God himself won't save him, that there's still hope. There are even hints in the Genesis story that Abraham knows that God will not, and in fact cannot take his son without breaking his own promise. There's a Jewish scholar called Lipman Bodoff, who has the interesting theory that Abraham is basically trying to call God's bluff. He's superficially going along with God's instruction to kill his son in full confidence that God couldn't possibly mean it. And there's a hint of this is that in the story when Abraham tells his servants that he and Isaac are going up the mountain, that I and the lad will go back. And when he reassures Isaac that God himself will provide the lamb for the offering, there's a little bit of a hint that he might genuinely be holding out hope that God's goodness is greater than it seems. In the end, of course, the angel appears and Isaac is released, and God seems no longer to be a threat to his own promises. This was all a test, a cruel test maybe, but it's a test that we might also go through ourselves, although hopefully not as extremely as Abraham. And seeing Abraham experience this sense of abandonment in the most extreme way possible and still come through the other side reminds us that even if we go through similar things, even if they're not that bad, not as bad as what Abraham went through, God is always there for us. Fleming Rutledge, an American Episcopalian priest, described it like this: Abraham's trial is a once-for-all event showing us that God can be trusted even in unimaginable darkness. Many have drawn strength from this story, learning what it means to trust God when he seems to have turned against his own works in incomprehensible self-contradiction. In other words, when God seems to be lying to your face. And I think there are a lot of hints here of the crucifixion story as well. Not just in the obvious literal parallels, like a father sacrificing his beloved son, but this idea of hoping even when it seems like God has turned against himself. If we think about when Jesus was on the cross, being crucified, suffering, if we put ourselves in the disciples' shoes, they had put all their hopes in Jesus. They knew him as the promised Messiah, the Saviour, the Son of God, who would free them from sin and the hands of their enemies. And then to see this Messiah, God himself in the flesh, God's chosen one, here to save everyone, hung on a cross and tortured to death, would have been incomprehensible. They might have asked themselves, why is God turning against his own chosen one like this? Why would God destroy his own promises like this? And if this is how God treats his own son, how is he going to treat the rest of us? Both Abraham and Jesus have a similar experience of entering out into both Abraham and Jesus both have an experience of being almost forsaken by God. Anyone else would have looked at them and thought, okay, God is done with you, God is punishing you, God is playing some sort of cruel trick on you. But they enter it with a lot of faith. And in doing so, they show that whatever we might feel in the moment, however much it might be easy to catastrophize or take a negative lens to everything and assume that God has rejected us, that God hates us, that God is punishing us, God is actually never, ever against us. In fact, God is so much for us that unlike Abraham and Isaac, he really did give his only son to show his love for us. Which I will make my Christmas connection, because obviously at Christmas, God sent his son to us as a gift to the whole world. In dying on the cross, Jesus shared our pain and all our moments of abandonment, despair, loneliness, and grief. God himself shared that sense of being abandoned by God and descended into hell, so there's nowhere we could possibly fall into that he couldn't save us from. For Abraham, for a few terrible days of his life, it might have seemed as if God himself had become his enemy. But through Jesus, God shows us that he has no enemies and wants nothing more than to make us all his friends. And even better yet, Jesus doesn't ask us to sacrifice our sons, but instead makes that sacrifice himself. We may not be able to muster up the gargantuan faith it took Abraham to lay his only son on the altar, and that's okay, because the faithfulness of Jesus covers us instead. Hebrews 11:19 says of Abraham that he considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham had hope in God's power of resurrection, both literal and figurative, to force goodness back out of despair. So to sum it all up, I think it makes the most sense to understand this story of the almost sacrifice of Isaac, not as a Sunday school story with a moral telling us, you need to do what God says even if it's deeply unethical, or you need to be prepared for God to ask you to do things that are hurtful or cruel. But it's a story about trusting God even in the most extreme circumstances. Very few of us, I hope, will be asked by God to do things like ritually sacrifice our loved ones, but probably quite a few of us will go through moments when it seems like God has left us behind. What this story tells us is that even those moments will never stop God from loving us. If we feel abandoned or rejected by God, it's not our fault. It's not a sign that God hates us, or that our faith isn't enough, or that God isn't real, or that we're too sinful, any more than it was for Abraham or for Jesus. Even in doubt, even in despair, even in the most hopeless situations, God will always be with us and always be for us. As Lamentations 3, verse 31 to 32 puts it, "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love." Thank you.